Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well. Pleased to report the sun is shining finally, albeit
Yes.
how long knows?
Finally, yes.
But finally, we've turned that corner, which is absolutely fantastic. And welcome to our third HR when HR meets GDPR session, if I can get my words out this morning. So in this session, we're going to be talking about employee exits and the data that falls behind that. So quite an interesting subject, quite a complex subject. So it should be really good content. And before we begin, of course, Christina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, I would. Thank you very much. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Christina from CVG Solutions, and I am a multi-award winning GDPR or data protection professional. I primarily work with small and medium-sized businesses, including charities. And I do that because I like to really see them thrive. And so I tend to gravitate towards them. I operate with a hands-on approach, practical and proportionate to my clients based on their size and complexity. I also use proven methodologies and best practices that I have acquired during my 25-year career in a large global corporation. And so I help my clients navigate the intricacy of GDPR, and I do that by educating them on the subject, which in turns that empowers them to make informative decisions, because as they say, knowledge is power, and I truly believe that. And so that enables them to operate with a high-performing culture that actually fuels their business growth. So for me, it's all about educating, empowering, and enabling, which is one of the reasons why I do this LinkedIn Live and free webinars. And I also have a podcast, which is called Why Such a Fuss? And you can find that on Spotify and in Apple. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you ever so much, and definitely would recommend listening to the podcast. I think Christina is absolutely full to the brim of really useful hints and tips in terms of that data. Pay me later. So I'm Julie. I am the founder of Puri Solutions. For those that have joined us previously, you'll have noticed a name change in the business. That's down to just business growth. So I've gone from BU Consultancy through to Puri Solutions. Puri is the hive. So I've gone from a singular bee to a hive where we're able to provide solutions through people. So what does that mean? It means I'm a HR consultant, and I have been for well over 24 years now. I'm also a leadership and confidence coach. On top of that, as well as doing people analytics and leadership training. There are lots of different things that really entwine into each other. And as Christina said, in terms of the knowledge is power, completely and utterly agree with that. And I think that's something that is so important to both of us, not only to be able to share all of that knowledge and empower individuals and empower businesses, but also to make sure that people are doing the right thing. That's really important. I work with SMEs over a range of different sectors, but really looking to support those ones that want to grow, want to invest and empower their people. So, Christina, over to you.
Yeah, so just to everybody to know that before we begin the sessions, just to make you aware that this session is being recorded. So obviously, we said, as Julie said at the very beginning, today's topic is about leavers, so people leaving the employment. So when we think of leavers, Julie, what are we actually thinking about?
Yeah, so leavers for me go into three different categories. Those that the employees choose to leave the business. So they resign. The employees where actually the business chooses that they leave. So for me, that category kind of holds the redundancy side, the dismissal side, the TUPE side, because of course they can be counted in terms of statistical analysis as involuntary leavers because they're not choosing to leave the business is choosing to, or not choosing, to lose a contract or a service, which is why they TUPE across. And the third category, and this is of course unfortunate to have to consider this, but actually it's for those people that have died. Now for me, many HR professionals argue that whether they should fall into the voluntary category, where the employee decides to leave, the involuntary category, where the employer decides they should leave. I'm on the fence with, unfortunately, with those that have died, as whether it was voluntary, involuntary. So I tend to put them in the third category.
Yeah,
which is always a difficult subject. But I think
it is, very sensitive as well. There's a lot of emotions there. But, you could argue that, the person that unfortunately passed away, they don't choose to pass away. But, So, so why is important then to separate them? What difference does it make?
So for me, there are different processes that come from those different types of leavers. If you've got an employee who's choosing to leave the business, or let's say you've got a dismissal or a redundancy or a TUPE, there's something completely different. And also for those people who are interested in people analytics, it's really important to separate the two, because when you're looking at your attrition rates, you will be looking at involuntary and voluntary leavers. So I think it's always important to consider those two. Just before we kind of move on, to say, if anyone's got any questions or anything, feel free to drop them into the chat and we will pick them up at the end. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah, good. Well spotted, Julie. I was at the beginning. So going back to what you were talking about, so in terms of the different processes, what are those processes? What do we need to consider?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about those that have chosen to leave voluntary, so the resignations, because they tend to be, the easiest in terms of a process thing. But the process that tends to happen is that you have someone resign. Now they've got to resign in writing. That could be, of course, text, WhatsApp, Facebook. Did once have someone who resigned and emailed the whole business to say that they were on a plane to start a new life, which wasn't necessarily following the right process or any process, but it was. It kick-started something. But it's really important we have that in writing. So one of the first points is, well, who does that letter go to? Especially, or who that information goes to. If we think of a letter, does it contain an employee address? It's got their name. We're starting to get into that personal information. We've then got the exit interview. Now, normally, if you've got an employee who volunteers to leave, they resign, most businesses will ask them to do an exit interview of some sort to collate information on why they're leaving, how they found their experience. And from my tenure in HR, you tend to find the reasons for people leaving crop up in the engagement surveys. So if there's issues with the facilities, that will come up on exits. We also need to think of the rest of the data that's included in the exit interview. So is it that someone raises a grievance as part of their exit interview, or is their resignation letter? And what happens with that? Because, of course, this is a primary opportunity for businesses to minimise risk to the business and to say, actually, we think there's a grievance, or there's something there that's that niggle of concern that we need to look into, because it's far easier and more beneficial for the business if you look into that when you receive it, rather than when you've got ACAS giving you a call saying, right, we need to look at early conciliation, this person's put in a claim.
I also think that, when a leaver, raises a grievance as part of leaving, even if it can't be resolved for that particular individual, whatever, if there is raised an issue, that it could be perceived as improvement from the organization perspective, so that they don't lose any more employees going forward. So I see it as a positive rather.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think in every which way you look at it, it's a positive, whether you're mitigating the risk for the business or whether you're actually looking to improve something within the business and lower your attrition rate. It's always going to be a positive. I think the other things we need to consider is, what do we do with that exit interview information? I've worked for quite a few businesses over my years who have collated all of this information for people of why they're leaving. They spend all that time investing in doing the exit interviews face to face and collating all the information, and then they do nothing with it. And it's kind of like, well, what on earth is the point? If you're going to do it, do something with the information, because that is your story. That's where your data is starting to be captured. And also, as Christina said, that's something that you can actually action to understand why people are leaving. Is it because it's seasonal work? Is it because actually there's concern with your pay level, your structure, the benefits you're offering? Are they targeting the right people in your business? Or are you just offering something because the person who does benefits wanted that benefit, so they brought it into the business? All of these things you can collate for that information. But of course, you have the information, you have more than likely their name attached to that exit interview. You possibly have the name in terms of the data as well. So what are you doing with it? Because then it falls into sensitive data. And I think other things to really consider, and this is something for people to take away, is who should do the exit interview? And should it be a manager? Should it be the HR team? Should it be someone completely independent? How does that work in your business? And the reason I ask you to ponder this is because if you go straight to the manager, if the employee has concern with the manager, they're really unlikely to tell that person. And I know, Christina, when we were talking about this subject, I said to you that I had it once where I worked for a small business. Being in HR, I report either to the HR director at the time, or I reported straight into the CEO. So the CEO did my exit interview, but he was the reason I was leaving.
Yeah.
So of course, when you're saying to me, why are you leaving? I'm like, career opportunities. I want to stretch my legs. All of those kind of generic answers, because it would have been so uncomfortable to me in my position to be able to say, actually, I'm leaving because I don't like the way you lead. Yeah. I would have had to work my notice, though, if I'd have said that. So it could have worked in my favour. We will never know. We will never know. But think about things like that. Also think about whether exit interviews should be mandatory. Now, the challenge or the thought process I've got with that is, one, I don't think they should be mandatory, because if you're asking people for their thoughts, their reasons, you don't want to force it. If people don't want to tell you, they're not going to tell you. They're not, like I did to the MD. You're going to make up some random reasons. So you're going to have dirty data going into your analysis. So the information that you have coming out isn't going to help you at all. I mean, Christina, I don't know, what do you feel about that? Do you feel they should be mandatory or voluntary?
I think they should be in the process, But then, if that happens or not, then I will leave it to the leaver in terms of their choice. So I would have it as part of your exit process, your end-to-end exit process as a step in your process. And then when it comes to it, sort of leave it to the leaver to sort of say, would you like to do an exit interview, and who would you like to do it with? That's obviously, whoever they choose, it needs to be someone in the leadership team, not necessarily the receptionist, as an example. So, there has to be some kind of logic behind that. But I would leave it as mandatory in terms of the feedback. But, normally, at least in my experience in the leaving interview, you then sort of start looking at, when can we collect your asset, and the practicality behind that. So that I would do as a mandatory thing. But in terms of the feedback, I would then leave it as a free choice for the individual.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's that kind of like, when do you do the exit interview? Do you do it the moment they resign and they've got to work 3 months notice, so create potentially a really awkward scenario? Or do you do it on the last day when, of course, they may not even show up for work? And I think that's down to every individual business to when they choose to do it. I kind of always try and aim for somewhere in the middle. So if they do have something that I need to talk to them about, I've still got time to do that. But it's not, you've resigned today, so we're going to sit down and do your exit interview now. Because equally, I think that's, I always feel it's a bit like sending a greeting card. You can send it and appear too keen that they've resigned.
Yes.
Or if you leave it to the last minute, do you really care?
Yeah.
Other things that I would think about are, do you do exit interviews for every level? So would you do an exit interview for an MD, a director, or is it just your lower level staff? And why is that? Is there a reason for it? But of course, if you're doing it for the MD, who on earth does that exit interview?
Yeah.
Because it would depend on the structure of your business, but actually it might be really relevant to have that. So yeah, lots and lots of different things to consider there. And as I say, it's really down to the individual business as to if they do it, when they do it. But all I can say is please make sure if you're collecting that information, you're doing something with it. Because of course, as we know from our previous time together, if you're not doing anything with it, why on earth are you collecting it? Don't need to collect it. So I think other things to think about are they going to work their notice? So are they going to go on garden leave? What's the message to the team? What's the impact of them leaving? Is there an impact? Does that kick off a restructure? Does it mean that you need to start the recruitment process? Are you going to agree a reason for leaving that's going to be communicated to the wider audience? What about your customers? Is there a transition? Is there a handover period for the rest of the team that need to pick up that work? All of these things can start being worked on during that notice period. Of course, if they're going straight onto garden leave, it may be a virtual notice period a virtual handover, that you need to do. But Christina, as you said, the access to the systems. Is there a risk to the business that therefore they need to go on garden leave? You need to cut access. What about if you just don't process their leaver? How does that work? And what then happens with the access? Because they may still be able to get onto the systems, and then you've got a massive risk there. So we need to think about all of this. I certainly know when I've worked in sales environments before, one of the main concerns that we have is people deleting data, either taking customer accounts with them or going on and deleting all of their inbox or deleting all of their drive. Now, of course, hopefully all of you have in play backups. I say hopefully, and hopefully they're working. Please check, because you never know that you need it until you need it. But it's another way of protecting your business. Other things to think of are reference requests. When do they come in? Who do they come into? Are the people who are going to give reference requests knowledgeable about what you should give? Because, of course, if you've got someone saying to a new, a future employer, oh, I wouldn't recruit them, they're absolutely useless, they did this, they did that, that's not going to stand your business in good stead. Not at all. References should only ever be factual. They shouldn't be opinion-based, which is why a lot of times the references are just get them into the HR team. There's a standard template. But also, we've got security clearances. We've seen a massive increase in security clearances being required. And I know in the future we've got a session planned on security clearances. But certainly a lot of times people can say, well, I need a security clearance for peace of mind, rather than actually they legally require a security clearance. But what happens if someone leaves your business and they've got security clearance? Do you inform the right people that they've left? Do you transition that out of your business, or do you just delete them off the Excel spreadsheet? All of this is that personal data. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, when on earth do you start the recruitment process? Because that's a huge thing. And consider what you need to think about that.
Yeah. And again, when you talk about, the data, so when an employee is leaving the organization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, as an employer, you need to give thought to access to your system. So in other words, you need to have a step in your process to remove those accesses, but also not just the system, but the physical buildings, cabinets, drawers if they've got keys, for example, or fob or whatever it might be, access to equipment like laptop, mobile phones, etc. Access to group chats, that they should be removed. That it might seem obvious, but when an employee leaves your organization, they actually no longer have authorization to have access to that data. So from a GDPR perspective, obviously I'm talking about personal data, but you should also think about your business data and also commercially sensitive information, financial information, business strategies. As Julie mentioned earlier, people downloading customers' contact details and taking them away with them as they leave. So they're taking away your customers. In some industries that is more relevant than others. But so think about that and think about protecting your business, because ultimately that employee could go and work for your competitors next week. So it's really important that you have that sort of sanity clean check exercise as part of your exit process, and you'll be surprised how many don't. You'll be surprised how many people still have access to their previous employer system, or to the building, because they still retained, the ID card that allows them into the building. So it's really important to think about that. Earlier on, we talked about the involuntary leavers. So excluding 2P for the minute, what are those different involuntary leavers situation?
Yeah, so for me, we're talking about redundancy. We're talking about dismissals, settlement agreements, and these are where businesses have come to an agreement of people leaving the business, but legally it's all signed, sealed, never to be spoken about again. The kind of things that we need to think out there are the redundancy pay. How is that being communicated to people? Who is that being communicated to? Has it been calculated? Often when I'm going through a redundancy consultation with people, we'll print out calculations to show people exactly how I've calculated their pay so that they can take it home, they can work through it, they can go on the government sites and they can check all of the calculations. Because for me, in a redundancy situation, the person still needs to feel some control over what's happening to them. So that's a way that I can give them that control, that they're checking my work for me. But the amount of people that fold up that piece of paper and put it in their pocket or leave it on the desk, and they've got their name on it, their date of birth on it, their age on it, their salary information. And you just think there's such a high risk there. We've also got employee relations when we come to dismissals. So the information that we've got there, investigations, we've got evidence, we've got minutes of meetings, statements from people, we've got lots and lots of sensitive information. We then potentially got an appeal process. So we've got more minutes, we've got more packs, we've got more information. And then potentially you've got the outcome of that. So it could be a reinstatement. And the process for a reinstatement, of course, is so different. So if you've got an employee that leaves the business due to disciplinary, that's one thing. Reinstatement, it's like it never happened. So all that information's got to go off their file. But of course, they may have to have, and likely to have, a different employee number, a different employee record within your HR system, but where all the information needs to transfer across where it's relevant, to make sure that they get the right holiday. So there's lots of complexities when it comes to putting people back on the system. Now, you might think, well, why can't you just reinstate them on their old number, for example? And sometimes you can, depending on whether their P45 has been issued, where it is in the payroll process, because the information is in real time to HMRC. So if HMRC has, and you've processed P45, you might be then putting them on the system all again from fresh. As I say, we've also got the settlement agreement. And for those people that aren't aware of the process, it's a big document. It's signed by lawyers. It's written for lawyers. It ties up any risk to the individual, to the business, and says, we're not going to discuss this again. This is what we're going to pay you to leave the business. This is what you've accrued. This is what you should be paid. This is the additional amount. But again, we've got really sensitive data there. And then, as you said, you've got all of the data. You've got all of the equipment. Now, the difference between someone resigning and choosing to resign and handing back information can be very different from those people that the employer is deciding that they leave. One place I worked, we would get people, if we dismissed them, they had to submit their vehicle there and then because they were no longer employed, so they couldn't be insured, and we would give them a train ticket to go home, and then we'd have to courier all of their personal belongings from the vehicle to them. But again, you're handling information. We've then, of course, got the data culture and what on earth is shared within the business and how that impacts the data culture that we talked about last time, but also the actual culture of how people feel. Do they feel engaged or do they feel panicked?
Yes. Yes. So, and I mean, for those of you that did not joined us last month on data culture, you can listen to the recording. Is on our LinkedIn page, so you can re-listen to it at any time. And thinking about sort of involuntary leavers, you've just made me think about that, Julie. 9 times out of 10, the employee is upset. And so the employer faces certain risk in terms of data, like data theft or deletion of information, as you've already sort of touched on. But there is also an increase of blackmail. So this is a case that actually happened in the last employer that I worked for. We had someone that, was dismissed, and before leaving, he downloaded various sort of information, personal data onto a stick. And then after he left, he then contacted us to say, I've got all of this information on this stick. I'm going to, make it public, release it, if you don't pay me so much money. So the funny thing is that this guy used his own personal email address to contact us. So we reported it to the police. So obviously, they found him very quickly. And then he obviously ended up in prison. And he ended up in a prison that my employer was managing. So that was quite fun. But one of the things that a disgruntled employee uses quite often to hurt the employer, it's submitting a subject access request, or SAR. And there are quite few situations where this has happened. And actually, and the reason why they do that is because they are hurt and they want to inflict pain and hurt to the organization. They're seeking a form of emotional revenge. So it is up to then the organization, the employer, to prove that the subject access request is manifestly unfounded. So yes, so it is a weapon that is being used quite frequently by disgruntled employees. So as an employer, you need to have your process ready. You need to be ready for that, and how to identify that they are manifestly unfounded. How to respond and how to handle it properly. So that's it's a weapon that they're using quite frequently. I want you to talk a little bit more about TUPE, Julie, for a minute, if you don't mind. Can you take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So the reason why Christina previously said that where the employer decides that an individual should leave doesn't include TUPE is because the process is slightly different. Now, TUPE is transfer of undertakings of particulars of employment. And what it means is if another organisation wins a service or part of a service, then individuals TUPE across. So you pick them up, you move them, put them down, and nothing of significance should change. There should be no detriment to an employee through going through TUPE. Now, there are certain elements that are going to change. For example, likely to change is the pay date, because you're not going to run a whole new pay day for a set of individuals. You're going to get them together. And that's all agreed in something called a measures letter. But when we start to think about initially a TUPE transfer, businesses will have to have an exchange of data in the form of due diligence with regards to their employees. And this will contain the most sensitive personal information for those employees, because it will not only be about their potentially their addresses, their salary details, their benefits, if they've faced any disciplinary information, anything like that. Now, a lot of organisations will share the information anonymously, if I can say it. Just slow down to say it. Others will share the information depending on whether they've got an agreement or not with businesses. But what I think is really important is to think about the information that you're sharing and why you're sharing it. Again, many times I've seen requests for information that it doesn't make any sense, or is completely irrelevant. For example, are they a trade union rep? Why does it matter? It doesn't. So you don't need to share that information. But when you're thinking about sharing this information, my biggest question is, how do you share it? How do you transfer that information? Now, we've got the transfer of the due diligence information, and then we've got all of the employee information, because once they've transferred to the new business or come into your business, you should have all of their employee file as if they've always been an employee of yours or an employee of the future. How do you share that? Now, I've had various ways of sharing. Due diligence information tends to be by spreadsheets. So please make sure you password protect. Think about the security element. Who's got access to it? What are you sending?
And also use encrypted emails to do that.
100%. 100%. But also then you've got these employee files. How are you sharing that information? I've known in all the years I've been in HR, in terms of sharing, sending the information by you printing it all out and sending it across. So you're making up employee files. How are you couriering it? Who are you couriering it with? Are they secure, or is someone going to open it? Data sticks, that was a common favourite back in the day. Just whack it on a data stick, put it in the post. Really consider how you're sending that information. Is it secure? I mean, Christina, there's so much I think that you can delve into there.
Yeah, that's another step. Just on security, but yeah, if you're doing it electronically, obviously, keep password protect the document, use pseudonymization whenever you can. If it's applicable, use anonymization, and also make sure that you are encrypting the emails, that it's an absolute must, I would say.
Definitely.
So yeah, you need to be very mindful who you're sharing the TUPE data with, because sometimes it's not just current employer and new employer. Sometimes there is a middleman, like a client of mine. He's a tender consulting specialist, and he supports schools with securing third-party contracts with catering, cleaning, facility management, that kind of stuff. And so he's part of the end-to-end process, the tender process and so on. And so as part of that process, he then receives the TUPE list, which is, in a spreadsheet, and it contains a lot of personal data, as Julie's just mentioned. So the current employer is sharing it with an additional third party, and so all the various safeguards that I've already mentioned needs to be in place, as well as various legally binding agreements must also be in place. And the things to consider also is how long to retain that data for, in terms of the old employer, and if you have a middleman, like in my client case. So think about your retention policy, think about where you're storing it, because the new employer is now the controller of that data and therefore responsible. So you need to think about, what you can or what you should retain, what you don't need to retain, and where you're storing it, how safely you're storing it, and who has access to it as well. Because again, access should be role-based in any circumstance, but also in this particular one. So yeah, lot to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And Christina, before we talked about Tupi, you mentioned about those joyful, disgruntled employees. And I would completely second what you said, because as a HR practitioner, you can see them coming in.
Yeah.
They've left the building, they've left the meeting. You know you're going to get a SAR. But is there anything that employees can do or be aware of that might help them?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, earlier, there are two scenarios, if you want, where the employer or the controller can refuse to process or to deal with a SAR request. And that is when the SAR is manifestly unfounded or manifestly excessive. So let's do one at a time. So let's look at the unfounded first. So the nature of this request is actually malicious. So the intent is to cause disruption to the organization. And actually, there's a very, very good example of this, which is very befitting to what we're talking about today, on the ICO GDPR guide. So I just want to read it to you guys, so just bear with me a minute. So it goes on and says, a worker, after being made redundant, submit a SAR to you as their former employer. They state that they are making a SAR in accordance with the UK GDPR, and it will withdraw it if you can agree on an improved financial package. So obviously this is kind of blackmail situation. If you give me more money, I'll take this pen away kind of scenario. So that it's malicious in nature, and therefore you will be perfectly in your right to refuse to do it, because it is definitely manifestly unfounded. With the excessive side, this is where the employer should look at, is the request unreasonable? Is it proportionate to the effort involved and to the cost? Is it repetitive? Okay, so they're asking the same thing over and over and over. What you've got to be mindful, though, is that a request is not necessarily excessive just because there is a lot of information involved. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Just wanted to, but what you've got to be aware of is that the burden to prove that the request is maliciously unfounded or excessive, it's on you as the employer. It's not on the employee to prove that. It's on you. So you need to do your homework. And I just wanted to actually just bring this in mind. That is something that a real case happened to a client of mine, where this disgruntled employee left the employment voluntarily, but under a little bit of a cloud. So he wasn't happy. And months later, he decided, tell you what, I'm going to submit a SAR. So he did. We responded, we acknowledged the receipt of it, and we asked him whether he could give us a little bit more information so that we could narrow down our search. Now, he responded that he wanted everything. Okay, everything under the sun. Now, what we need to think about is that this employee was working for my client for 4 years. So if you just think of the emails volume, that's quite a lot. It's a huge, a lot of data to go through. My client is a small organization with very limited resources, and this would cost, several thousands of pounds to go through. So it's quite a big effort, and it will bring a lot of disruption to the business. So we wrote back to him, and so to letting him know that the amount of data that we would have to sift through it was quite large. I think it was 240 gigabyte. And that in order to do that, we would need to bring some additional staff, at an additional, a cost of, and we gave him the cost, and then we would expect him to contribute towards it, which is quite reasonable, and it is perfectly legal to do so. And so based on that, we refused to carry out the request. Now, we've not heard back from him at all, so we've closed it. But if he comes back to us, willing to work with us, willing to, help us to narrow down the search, we're more than happy to support a genuine request. But in that particular scenario, as I've explained, that one, we were able to prove that it was manifestly unfounded, and we've documented it as such. So you need to do your homework. You need to know what you're doing and actually document everything, because you need to be able to justify. So these could come back to us in a different form, but we've got it all documented. And as a measure, as a precaution, I also had a chat conversation with the ICO, and they've confirmed that what we're doing is fine, so that I've got that chat saved in case we need to use that at a future date to justify and to protect us. So I did that as a precaution, but this is the kind of homework that you need to do, and save it and all together in a proper document. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Julie, is death, and I really want to explore that, because in my years of in leadership roles, I never had to deal with that. Never had a colleague sort of die, and so, but I can sort of think that it's obviously it's traumatic for the family of the deceased, but it's also traumatic for the team, for the colleagues of that individual. And when you are a manager of people, you obviously have to deal, not only you have to deal with your own personal emotions, but also support your team with their own emotion, with how they're dealing with the loss of a colleague. So it is quite a difficult and delicate, scenario, I would think. Have you ever had to experience that?
Unfortunately, yes.
Right.
Unfortunately, too many times to. It's something, and especially during COVID, it was something that you're very aware of when you're reaching out to people. But I've experienced employees dying on site, and also at home, or in road traffic accidents, for example, and dealing with that. And I think it's a very, very delicate, difficult time, especially for managers, supporting their team, so trying to support themselves, get their heads around it. And that's where I'd say really rely on your HR contact, because hopefully they'll be able to guide you through the process. The areas that are, I'm going to say, important to get right, and this is from a process side rather than an emotional side, is the message that goes out to the workforce and the reasons. Is it in agreement with the family? Does it put the business at risk? Are you sharing too much information? And again, like I said, with regards to the greeting cards, if you look like you've already got something set up, it can look like, well, we're already prepared for this, so it's all fine. It's not that much of a shock. If you send it a week after the person's died, you don't care. You've just disengaged your workforce. So again, that's really important. But the behind the scenes, you've got to deal with insurance potentially. So what are the reasons? What is the data that you're sending out? Potentially you're working with employee assistance programs. Now, a lot of them will offer to come on site and talk to individuals, do group sessions, talk about bereavement, about what people may be thinking and feeling. But again, how much information do you share with those people? Do you have an agreement in place, or is it just Joe Blogs has been recommended to you, so you get them in? You know nothing of their credentials. You might have death in service payments that goes out. Who's that going to? If the person who the death in service is registered to is under 18, there might be more complications in terms of how that money is sent. Is it put into a trust? Who looks after that trust? Is it with the board of directors? All of that information we need to think about. And again, we're thinking about that data culture. So how are we using this information? How are we sharing this information? And what are we sharing? Because that is setting our precedence of what we're saying to the business and our customers over what's going on. It could be that you put out of offices on the email account, which is a great thing to do because, of course, as a customer, you want to know that that person's not in. What do you put as the message? Do you just put they've died? What impact does that tell you? What data culture does that tell you? So there's all these different things that you need to consider. So Christina, in terms of GDPR, how does it work for someone who's deceased?
So from a GDPR, it's actually very simple. So in terms of the personal data of the deceased, actually it comes out of scope of GDPR. So it means that GDPR doesn't apply. And the reason for that is because the aim and the purpose of GDPR is to protect living individuals. So the living is the key word, to protect them from harm through the use of their personal data. So if they are deceased, they are not going, their emotion, their psychological mindset, their physical, situation, they're not, no harm can come to them in that respect. They no longer going to be impacted, in terms of their rights to, their rights and freedom. So there's no risk to those rights. So again, from the GDPR, it's out of scope. Now, that does not mean that their data should be disrespected. I think that we should still consider ethics and moral and apply those. But from a GDPR perspective, it's very simple. It's out of scope. So all of the rules, if you want, do not apply. I'm just conscious of time because we are running out of time. So I just wanted to quickly touch on, if you don't mind, Julie, on thinking about when an employee leaves and you have allowed them to use their own devices. So how do you ensure that when the employee leaves, you as their employer delete the business data, which is personal data, from those devices, because it's not yours, but you are still responsible and you're still are obliged to follow the data protection for the data that it is on those devices. And so you're responsible for ensuring that that data is deleted. Now, you need to have a strong bring your own device policy. You should also have, in your employment contract that when the employee leaves for whatever reason, or voluntary or involuntary, if they're allowed to use their device, they should, delete the data. They should provide confirmation of that. You could also use what is called mobile device management, which basically allows you to delete the data from that device with, literally the click of a button. But what you need to consider if you do that is that the app allows the employer to then monitor and track the employee. And so you need to make sure that you are using that data that is being recorded and tracked by the app only for the purpose that you need. and no other, that you're not using it for, say, for example, COVID monitoring or for ongoing surveillance. Okay, so you're only using it for the purpose of, deleting the data. The owner of the device, or the employee in this instance, should be fully informed of the use of the mobile device management system, and also that introduces tracking and what that means to them, because obviously it is an invasion of privacy, because it will be able to monitor the sort of their geolocation. So if they're going to the doctors, if they're going to, I don't know, visit family, it monitors the usage of the device. So obviously, in the evening, say it's a mobile phone, in the evening, it probably would be a lot of, personal usage rather than company usage. So you got to be mindful of that. So you make sure that you have really strong policies and processes to deal with if someone leaves, how you're going to make sure that the data is removed from the devices that don't belong to you as an organization, but belong to the employee.
Christine, can I ask? And this is a question that's come in terms of a contractor or a temporary worker that's had their own laptops. How does it work there? Because I know you were saying about you've got to have it in the contract of employment, but if you've got a contractor, for example, you wouldn't have that.
But you will still have a contract, even if it's a contract of service, to say you're going to give us this many hours for this, with your special skills, whatever the skills is. You can still add that to that. But the other things, again, you can sort of make sure that, I don't know, maybe they use a separate VPN from, or from the employee, from their personal, so that they only access the data through that specific network. And so you're keeping the data separate. So there's no, you should also ensure that they don't download or save anything on their device, for example. It's having, I would have the policy, but I will also do audit on a regular basis to those self-employed or contractors, because you are a risk as an employer. You are a risk. So because, legally, you're still responsible for that data.
And it would be down, I'm presuming it would be down to the company rather than the contractor to make sure that that is within the agreement of work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, in the same way that you would do for an employee, in terms of you would only allow them access in line with their role, the same with the contractor. But, I would also, in the contract, I would put confidentiality clauses, I would, and also make sure that you have provision in there so that if the contractor doesn't follow your policies with regards to, in this particular case, deleting or not downloading certain data, then you have recourse.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to be really cheeky. And so we've got another question that's come in terms of when there's an investigation, can the employee and other members request to see the notes and minutes if they've been mentioned within that investigation? And what's the best way to handle requests like that?
Okay, so basically that will follow under the subject access request, in terms of, the employees can ask for the personal data, in those notes and minutes. So you need to then redact anything that is not relevant to them. So they're entitled to the content, if you want, that is relevant to them, but not the document, if that makes sense. Okay. So, and then the other team members, if they are relevant to that meeting, to those notes and minutes, they can also request. Again, they will only get the piece that is relevant to them. They will not get what is relevant to someone else's. So they're not going to get the whole document, and they shouldn't, because again, as an employer or controller under the GDPR, you need to protect other people's, privacy. So you can't divulge that.
Yeah. Completely.
Yeah.
Completely. So we've come to the end of our time. We've had an absolute packed hour. It's been absolutely fantastic. I hope you all have enjoyed it as much as Christina and I have. We have news that our next LinkedIn Live is going to be on the 15th of May, and we're going to be talking about employee performance. So the link's going to be going out towards the end of this week. So do make sure, of course, that you sign up, because we'd love to see you. And let us know if you've got any questions or want to talk through anything that you've heard either during this session or previous sessions. We'd love to hear from you again. So take care, and thank you ever so much.
Yeah, and thank you very much for a very interesting question. So cheers, and lovely being here. So hopefully to see you soon again next month. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.